Welcome to the Religious Feminism Podcast. I'm your host, April Young Bennett. I am a Mormon feminist, and today I am interviewing some of our Jewish feminist sisters. And so I will let them go ahead and introduce themselves.
I'm Sheva Marcus. I'm the president of the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. It's an organization that was created about 20 years ago. And we're so happy to be part of this podcast. I found it so interesting and eye-opening when I watched the first one that you guys did. I thought it was amazing. I'm 56 years old. I think that's relevant only because I think when I was a teenager and I started getting involved in the feminist community, I didn't think the changes that we've seen in the last 40 years were ever going to happen, and it's been incredible for me to do that. Professionally, I'm a sex therapist, and so I do a lot of work with sexual education, and I'm just thrilled to be here.
Hi, and I'm Sharon Weiss-Greenberg. I'm the executive director of JOFA. Sheva and I are partners in crime. And I'm going to do the shameless plug now, so that way it's in there. Given Sheva's professional background, we obviously take advantage of that. And we have a podcast that you may also want to listen to called The Joy of Text, and it's about sex and Jewish law. So I'll throw that out there. But I'm a newly minted fan of this podcast, and I listened to the first two a few times, so that I'd be ready for all of this. So I'm excited about the work that you're doing and about today's conversation.
Thank you. And we will definitely link to your podcast in our show notes so people can look that up. All right, when we start this podcast, we like to start off talking about some of the positive things that we love about our faith and our faith community. Can you tell us about some of those things?
So I love the sense of community. I mean, I noticed that in your first podcast with the women speaking to. I feel like there's such a tight community that I really feel like millennials don't see. And people growing up today, they just don't have a sense of community, and we really do have a sense of community. And I feel like that's because we have a shared purpose. And there's a sense that we want to make the world a better place, and that we're not just here for ourselves, but we're here for a greater good. And so that is the closeness and the sense of purpose, I think, are the two issues that really keep me deeply lodged in the Jewish Orthodox community.
So I think I'm going to concur that community is pretty important, such that, you know, I was once flying out of a conference in Vermont, and then the plane was stuck for a few hours, and this is on a Friday, and the Sabbath is approaching. And then they made an announcement that there are no hotels, there's nowhere to stay, so you're going to have to stick it out. And I thought, I can't stick it out. And there's always, you know, with a quick Google search from a borrowed laptop, you find a place to stay before the Sabbath commences. And it's pretty incredible, the network that's available to people you don't know, but it's also incredible the network of people you do know. There's this reality in the Jewish world when you meet someone, you play what's called Jewish geography. And basically your introduction isn't complete until you've identified a handful of people that both of you know. So I think community is very important, and I think that that's part of what makes that's going to be a theme that you see over and over. And with my bachelor's in Jewish history sociology, I would say that social bonds, you know, that Emil Durkheim sort of identifies as the strongest factor for people why we're tied to this. And while there is a belief system, I'd say in Judaism, what trumps everything else is really our practice and our community.
Thanks. Let's talk about some of the things we love about our feminist communities. Can you tell me a little bit about your feminist community?
Sharon, why don't you start with this one?
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting is I don't think, I didn't know much about feminism, certainly Orthodox feminism or Jewish feminism, until I was pretty much graduated from college. I grew up in Atlanta in the South, and I knew that I liked going to synagogue, and that most people didn't. Most of my girlfriends did not, and that it wasn't normal to want to go on a Friday night to services. So once I the way that sort of explained feminism is that at one point you get it, you have that aha moment, and once you have the gendered goggles on, and that's language I borrow from Ruthie Worshenbrat, the gendered goggles, that once you have them on, you can't see the world differently. And then once you see the world differently, it's really important to have like-minded people to laugh with, to vent with, and to move forward with, to shift the paradigm. And that's a lot of what Jofa does, I think.
So my feminism kind of started young, and I, ironically, my dad, who really does not consider himself a feminist, created a feminist, or me and my sister created kind of two variations of feminism. Jewish tradition is very bound up in the oral tradition of the Talmud. The laws of Judaism are very much bound up in the Talmud, and traditionally the boys have learned Talmud, and so the boys will start learning Talmud in like 5th grade, and they'll learn it for the rest of their lives, and it's huge amounts of material to master. And when my brother started learning Talmud in 5th grade, my father, who was definitely not a feminist, but he was an intellectual, staunch supporter of intellectualism, could not stomach the fact that his boys were learning Talmud and not his daughter. And so he started teaching us Talmud, which kind of basically opens the doors, it opens the books on Orthodox Judaism, on Judaism in general. And I made friends, basically my closest friends throughout high school and college were other girls whose fathers had also sort of unwittingly opened this world for them. And so I met these other women who were incredibly steeped in the Jewish the Jewish laws and tradition, and able to manage text in a really sort of a sophisticated way. And that has been the case all my life with my feminist friends, most of them within the Jewish community. They are some of the smartest, most interesting, most alive women, and I couldn't live without my feminist pillar.
Could you tell me a little bit about the status of women within your faith, about what kind of inequalities exist?
So I need to start by saying you can't lump, our faith into one group. And I don't know over the course of time whether you will have sort of different denominations of the Jewish community, but the Jewish community splits itself very, being a little disingenuous in terms of the overarching generalizations here, but there's the Orthodox group, there's the conservative group, and there's the Reform group, with each of those groups kind of being more fundamentalist. So the Reform group is the most kind of lenient about laws and most, the least structured in terms of laws and covenants. The conservative group a little more so, the Orthodox group most traditional, most close to the faith, I would say, in terms of the traditional view of what the faith looks like. Within the Orthodox community, you can get even way more sort of fundamentalist than either Sharon or myself. You'll see women who cover their hair, who wear wigs or who wear hats, who don't wear pants, who wear long sleeves, who cover up much more than we do. So there's a very, very, very broad range. But the status of women, like I think probably almost every other faith group, the more traditional you get, the more fundamentalist you get, the more likely it is to find women's positions being that held down from the male perspective. So the more likely you are to see male, a patrilineal, a patriarchy, where the men are much more involved in the leadership and the lawmaking than you will see with the women. But I'm sure Sharon has what to add on that as well.
So what's interesting, I think, about our religion is that we certainly don't have a centralization of power. And I would actually say knowledge is truly power in our community. You could be born a man, but if you can't quote rabbinic texts without, in a very fluent manner, you're not respected. You need to know your stuff. And one of the major accomplishments of feminism or women's learning is that it really matters. And there's often this argument that comes up, the slippery slope, the idea that, you give us one little branch and that will, one little bit that you let them learn a little bit of Torah, and then all of a sudden they're going to be rabbis, which we call it an upward ramp rather than a slippery slope. But when it comes to feminism, I would say in the Reform community, they're not bound by halacha, they're not bound by Jewish law, such that any laws having to deal with differences between sexes and genders just don't apply. When it comes to the Reconstructionist movement, I would say there's although their ideology is different, I would say that that same reality exists. In conservative Judaism, you have certain laws that were passed to create the possibility for women to count, to literally count in a quorum. In order to say certain prayers, you need to have a quorum, and women do not count in a quorum in Orthodox Judaism. Only in the Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative movements do they count, and only in the other movements can, for now, and some of this is about to change, can they serve as a witness and as a judge in a Jewish court. Within Orthodoxy, this is interesting for my dissertation, I had to explain the inequality. So there's this inequality that we can't count in order to form a quorum, in order to pray together. And there's certain things that you can't do, like mourning your loved one, you say a certain specific prayer, and you can't do that if you don't have 10 men. You could have 9 men and 1,000 women, and you still can't say that prayer. So that's a challenge to make light of it. But there are some halachic, there's some legal differences between men and women, but there's also sociological norms of our community and also society at large. So, for example, I found out that my male colleague, where I used to teach in a Jewish day school, was making $25,000 more than me. Despite my having more experience and having what I would say equitable degrees. There's a Jewish volunteer ambulance service, an EMS service, and only men can serve in them, women cannot. I guess just men are paid more, men tend to be paid more than women, and that happens across denominations. Men tend to have more of the leadership positions. That does happen across denominations, although it happens far more often in the Orthodox community. And it was a little less than 10 years ago that that Yeshiva at Maharat began. It's the first yeshiva, the first house of learning where women can study to become halachic spiritual leaders. In other words, they become rabbis. And at this point, there are 19 graduates. We just had the most recent graduation this past Sunday. And now there are 4 yeshivot in Israel where women can also be ordained under Orthodox auspices. So it's sort of a game changer. And what's interesting is that there wasn't much of a backlash in its initial stages. And as it became clear that we're not going anywhere and that women are ready, able, and willing to serve the community, you see some of the major umbrella organizations like the Rabbinical Council of America, which includes 1,000 rabbis, and the Orthodox Union, which is a combination of kosher certification, which is a hundreds of millions dollar industry. They make a lot of money off of making sure that things are kosher. But they also offer services to the community, like youth groups or what have you. But they've gotten involved in this battle against women rabbis. And there's a variety of titles that women use, and some will use the title rabbi, some will use the title rabbah, some will use the title maharat, which stands for Manhigat Hilchatit Ruchanit Toranit, leader of Jewish law, spirituality, and Torah. So I've thrown a lot out there, but basically it gives you on maybe one foot for a long time.
Can I jump in? I think one of the things that struck me very strongly after I listened to the first podcast where you were talking about the Mormon community was how decentralized we are in the Jewish Orthodox community, and how much of a leg up that gives us, because it could mean that even though in large parts of the swaths of the community they do not accept women leadership or women rabbis, we can create our own community that does. However, you should be aware that, we're talking from a very small niche, right? Like there are hundreds and thousands of people in the Orthodox community who would look at us and say, oh, they're not actually really Orthodox because they advance women's issues. And so it's kind of it's like almost like a double-edged sword. Like we have that because we aren't centralized. But on the other hand, because we're not centralized, we can be, sort of, you use the term excommunicated. We don't have like formal excommunication in our community, but it's an informal excommunication, I think, would be a good way to describe it.
I would say, however, in Israel, that you do have this centralization of power because you don't have a division between church and state, and the Rabbanut controls, which tends to be the ultra-Orthodox, controls things like civil matters such as marriage and divorce, which complicates things in such a way that we don't experience outside of Israel.
Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the goals that the Jewish Orthodox feminist community is working toward?
So, the way we would describe what we do is that we're trying to find as much position for women. Like, in other words, we're trying to find as much leadership potential, involvement for women as we are allowed to do within the confines of Jewish law. The Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance was created in order to allow as much leeway for women, to give them as many roles as possible and as many directions as possible as are allowed according to Jewish law. And as Sharon suggested earlier, a lot of what women aren't allowed to do in this day and age, we've come to realize is social norms and not Jewish law. And so, like, for example, the issue of women rabbis, that is not a Jewish legal issue. It's almost impossible to find any Jewish texts that tell you that it's not okay for women to be a rabbi. And part of what happened when the women became educated and scholarly is now they could look at you and say, really? You show me a text that says that it's not okay for a woman to be a rabbi. So then that forces the community to sort of the more fundamentalist part of the community to say, okay, well, it's not really in the text, but it's just never been done. And so that in itself becomes a reason not to do it. And so our goal is to really push ahead the agenda of women in everywhere, in every place and way in which women are allowed according to Jewish law. And that means ritually, in all the Jewish rituals and all the public Jewish rituals, which traditionally were reserved for men. That means in terms of education, really allowing women a full, the full gamut of education. That means in terms of communal leadership, and spiritually. So in all of those realms, that's where we're pushing women.
Knowledge, I said this before, but I'll say it again, knowledge is power. And the way that I like to think about it, if you think back, 25, 30 years ago, you would ask your rabbi, can a woman touch a Torah? Or can a woman say kiddush? Can women, say the prayer over wine that we say when the Sabbath begins? And a rabbi would shrug his shoulders and say, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And now we say, sorry, the sources, you don't have halachic ground to stand on. That in today's world, we can be the ones shrugging our shoulders and saying there's actually no legitimate reason. There's nothing within the thousands of pages of rabbinic texts that would support the notion that a woman can't serve as a rabbi. And what's interesting is most recently, the Orthodox Union held this sort of panel for over a year, a handful of powerful rabbis wrote a psak halacha, which is basically a
responsa.
And in the end, there wasn't much law that they even referenced because it wouldn't hold. And in the end, what they're now sort of using is they say that it's not halacha, it's not Jewish law. There's a meta halacha, that it's like it's beyond the Jewish law because we can tell them, you're grasping at straws. You don't know what you're doing. So it's a really great time to be an Orthodox feminist because we now have the most educated generation, I would say, in Jewish history. And so you can't get away with pretending that sources exist when they don't. We can call you out on that. And I think the combination of that and just people who feel empowered to not only know, but to share their voices is making great changes.
Do you have any other success stories that you want to tell us about? It sounds like you're already having a great deal of success.
So I would say just the questions have changed. That a number of decades ago, you'd be asking, can a woman do X? Can a girl celebrate her bat mitzvah? And today, and that's, the boy has a bar mitzvah, a girl has a bat mitzvah. Now, it's not a question if she'll have one, but it's a question of how will she celebrate that? What will she study? What sort of ritual will she engage in? It's not a question of will women have some sort of a role in the wedding? The question is, what will it look like and how will it be shaped? So I think we're just thinking differently than we did a number of years ago. Sheva, do you want to think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a great, Sharon mentioned bat mitzvah, and I'll just say when I was 12 years old, like I have an older brother, and he had a huge bar mitzvah, just like you would expect. He read from the Torah. We had 300 guests or whatever they had. My parents made a big celebration. And for my bat mitzvah, my mother made like a picnic with 4 friends. And that was considered just sort of the appropriate thing to do because, of course, you don't celebrate a daughter's bat mitzvah. But by the time my daughter came around, and she had her bat mitzvah, which was already 7 years ago, she like completed an enormous tractate of Talmud. She read from the Torah, and that world has completely changed. But again, I mean, I just want to hazard you, that's a small slice of the world. There's still lots and lots of Orthodox Jews, I would say most of them, I would say probably 80% or 85%, in which, women are just thought of differently. But it does very much feel like the sands shift. So I'll give you a perfect example. JOFA, Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, did a lot on domestic violence. We did a lot of work on domestic violence and trying to bring it out in the open because like other communities, I'm assuming nobody ever wants to wash their dirty laundry in public. And so people pretended like there was no sexual abuse, there's no domestic violence, it was just the way it was, pretending. And I had a friend who is a little bit more on the fundamentalist religious group, and she went to a group of like very ultra-Orthodox rabbis and women, and they had something on domestic violence, and the rabbi at the front of the room, long black coat, big black beard, got up and said something to the effect of, if the women would just, toe the line better or not challenge so much, then it would all be better. And one of the ultra-Orthodox women stood up with, her hair, every bit of her hair covered, and her long skirt, and she stood up and she said, with all due respect, Rabbi, that's just not the case. And she argued back. And my friend said, it's true that the ultra-Orthodox community hasn't in any way gone as far as you guys have gone, but it's trickle-down effect. Like every little thing that you guys do, every glass ceiling that you shatter, it may take another 20 years for them to shatter it, but they get it. They start hearing it too. And so even though in the ultra-Orthodox communities, their daughters are not like making bat mitzvahs with huge celebrations and huge completions of tractates, but they're doing something, as Sharon said. And so the pendulum, it's almost like the pendulum is just swinging very slowly in that direction. And that, I feel like, is probably the biggest success that we've had.
I also think that that things are changing for the ultra-Orthodox community. And even from, I started this job 3 years ago, and I met with Leah Vincent, who left the ultra-Orthodox community and went through a rather painful series of personal life events. But I asked her, are there feminists in the ultra-Orthodox community? And she said, Sharon, there's nobody. Well, now there are. And I don't think it necessarily was born from, I think it came from things moving too far to the right, that eventually women have to stand up for themselves. And I think that women, once they feel disempowered, no matter the type of affiliation they have, you're going to have to stand up for yourself and for your sisters. There's a new trend in ultra-Orthodox publications and magazines and newspapers not to publish images of women. So you'll honor a couple for a synagogue dinner, and you'll only see the husband's face. And sometimes you'll only see the husband's name, and you won't see, women's names in newspapers. And that's actually not being stringent. That's being, that's beyond the pale. And I think a lot of the times people talk about what's the red line for going too far to the left. And I think it's also important for us to think about what's the red line of going too far to the right. And for a number of women in the ultra-Orthodox community, that line is being crossed. Certainly as it comes to the erasure of women from publications, that's a big one, I would say. And also women now, you see a suffragette movement happening in Israel now, where ultra-Orthodox women want to be able to run for office in their parties. In Israel, there are many, many, many political parties. And basically the way it works is you're supposed to vote for your affiliation if you're ultra-Orthodox. And you have women fighting now saying, I'm not voting for this party until you let women serve in the Knesset and in the government as well, which is a pretty bold sort of thing to do. You have the granddaughter of the former one of the chief rabbis of Israel, his daughter, not his granddaughter, is fighting for women to be able to have a college university education. And these are important things: the right to vote, the ability to serve in office, and the ability to be able to pay to earn a proper salary. Part of the restriction in terms of women's education in the ultra-Orthodox community, and I'm talking about a secular university education, was denied for some time, and women are fighting for that right now. So it looks different in terms of what the fights are and what the goals are, but people are standing up.
Another area where I feel like we've definitely made inroads, and I know this one is dear to Sharon's heart and dear to my heart, is doing better sex education. In the Orthodox community specifically, really women and men are encouraged to have very, very limited physical contact before they get married. No physical contact. I was being. They're encouraged to have very limited physical contact, limited or no physical contact before they get married. And before they get married, they would meet with a bridal teacher to learn about all the laws and all the responsibilities that you have to do. Religious sexual ethics and customs are so far and away the most complicated of any religion. And I, at this point, really feel qualified to say that because I've met with women from so many religions. And so they meet with a bridal teacher to talk through kind of all the laws of when you're allowed to have physical contact, when you're not. And those teachers would never really talk to them about sex. And so we created a class, and we flew in bridal teachers from around the country and the world to give them 3 or 4 days with a number of other institutions of a much broader range of religious legal responsibilities and answers, and also sex education, so that they could give good sex education to the brides that they were about to teach. And this year we expanded that to the grooms as well. I feel like that's had such a huge impact, and we've seen that sort of growing more and more. There have become more and more sex therapists in the Orthodox community in Israel and here, because it was a real problem. Like, we believe in monogamy as a religion. We believe in long-term monogamy, and sexuality is a big piece of that. And so being able to address that in an open way that was helpful to people was a very important project of ours. I think we're really starting to make headway in.
Well, before we close, do you have any advice for any of our listeners who might be working to improve gender equity within their own faiths?
One thing I would say is don't give up. Like, sometimes it's so frustrating. Like, there's nights that I almost cry myself to sleep because I feel like you take 3 steps forward and then you take 1 step back. Sharon talked about the fact that that this large organization just came down against women rabbis. But I really do feel like in the end will prevail because it's right. It's the right thing. And if you do it respectfully and honestly, in the end we will prevail. So I do feel like try not to get frustrated. Make sure you have a group of supporters, men and women, who are supporting what you do. That's absolutely critical. And just don't give up. That would be my advice. And I'm curious what Sharon would say.
I would say you're never alone, and it's important to realize that. And I agreed. I've shared with Sheva some of my challenging moments, specifically on social media. It's tough to be a woman on social media, certainly an Orthodox feminist on social media. But I think you just keep putting one foot in front of the other and realize that each day is an opportunity to make some sort of progress. And as long as you make even a minuscule amount of progress, you're going to get there. You're going to keep shifting the paradigm and pushing the envelope. And I think it's important to celebrate all those successes, no matter how small or large, and just keep thinking about the big picture, and that's our future.